There's a quiet moment when connection begins to feel heavier than solitude. Not loud, not dramatic, just a soft internal shift where answering a message feels exhausting, where presence starts to feel like performance, where distance feels safer than closeness. People who cut everyone off are rarely cold. They're often deeply sensitive. They once paid close attention. They once stayed longer than was healthy. They once hoped that being patient, understanding, and available would eventually be returned. But something changed. Not overnight, not because of one event. It happened slowly, through small disappointments, unspoken boundaries, and emotional debts that were never repaid. This is not the psychology of isolation as rebellion. It is the psychology of retreat as protection. A story about how withdrawal can feel like the last remaining form of self-respect. It focuses on subtle fatigue, emotional overstimulation, and the gradual internal distancing that happens long before relationships are physically severed. The chapter sets the emotional foundation for understanding withdrawal as a process, not a decision. No one wakes up one day and decides to disappear. Long before the silence, there's a feeling, a quiet internal hesitation, a pause before responding, a breath held slightly longer than before. At first, it does not feel like withdrawal. It feels like tiredness, the kind that cannot be fixed with rest. Conversations begin to require effort instead of curiosity. Social spaces that once felt warm now feel loud. Even familiar voices begin to demand energy rather than offer comfort. This is where the first withdrawal begins, not in action, but in sensation. People often misinterpret this stage. From the outside, nothing looks different. The person still shows up, still listens, still replies. But internally, something is shifting. Emotional attention starts to feel stretched thin. The nervous system begins to brace instead of open. Psychologically, this is often the earliest sign of emotional overload, when empathy has been overused without restoration, when presence has been given freely without being replenished. The mind begins to associate connection with depletion rather than nourishment. It is not resentment yet. It is not anger. It is fatigue without a clear source. The person may not know why they feel this way. They may even feel guilty for it. After all, nothing bad has happened. No obvious betrayal, no dramatic rupture, just a growing sense that something feels off. This is the subtle danger of emotional exhaustion. It does not announce itself loudly. It arrives quietly, disguised as introversion, busyness, or mood. The person tells themselves they just need space, a little time, a few quiet days. But space begins to feel necessary, not optional. Messages sit unanswered longer, not because they are unimportant, but because responding feels heavier than before. Social invitations provoke a sense of pressure instead of anticipation. The body tightens at the thought of engaging, even with people who are kind. It is not because those people have suddenly changed. It is because the internal capacity to hold them has. At this stage, many people push through. They override the signal. They tell themselves to be polite, to be available, to not disappoint. And in doing so, the withdrawal deepens quietly. The nervous system learns that connection requires self-erasure. Over time, the emotional cost accumulates. What begins as tiredness becomes irritability. What begins as quiet becomes withdrawal. The person may find themselves listening without really hearing, nodding while mentally pulling away, offering care out of habit, not presence. This is not cruelty, it is survival. In psychological terms, this phase reflects early boundary collapse. When a person has not learned how to regulate closeness, the only available control becomes distance. The body seeks safety not through communication, but through reduction. And so, emotional availability begins to shrink, not consciously, not deliberately, but instinctively. There is often a sense of grief here, though it is rarely named. A grief for how connection used to feel. A grief for the ease that once existed. The person may feel confused by their own withdrawal. They may wonder why they no longer feel excited to share, to be known, to engage. What they are experiencing is not disinterest, it is emotional saturation. The psyche has reached a limit. At this stage, cutting people off is not yet an intention. It is a slow turning inward, a subtle recalibration. The mind begins to scan for quiet. The body begins to crave solitude, not as escape, but as relief. And relief feels necessary. The most important thing to understand about this first withdrawal is that it is protective, not punitive. It is not about rejecting others, it's about preserving what little energy remains. The person is not becoming cold, they are becoming cautious. They are learning, often for the first time, that connection without boundaries carries a cost. And because boundaries have not yet been internalized, distance becomes the only available form of regulation. This is how the path begins, not with disappearance, but with a quiet shift inward, a moment where silence starts to feel kinder than speech. It looks at childhood environments, attachment patterns, and emotional conditioning that taught the nervous system to associate closeness with uncertainty, pressure, or loss of self. Withdrawal does not appear in isolation. It has a history. Long before someone learns to step away from everyone, they first learn how connection feels in their earliest relationships. These experiences do not have to be extreme to leave an imprint. Often they're subtle, ordinary, repeated just enough times to become normal. For some, closeness was inconsistent. Care arrived unpredictably, warm one moment, distant the next. Affection felt conditional, dependent on performance, mood, or silence. Love was present, but unreliable. And the nervous system learned something quietly important. Connection requires vigilance. For others, emotional expression was discouraged, needs were minimized, sensitivity was labeled as weakness or inconvenience. The child learned that being too much led to withdrawal, criticism, or discomfort in others. Over time, they adapted by becoming smaller emotionally, quieter, less demanding. These environments teach a specific lesson. Closeness is not safe unless it is controlled. Psychologically, this forms the foundation of avoidant or disorganized attachment patterns. The child does not consciously decide to withdraw. Instead, their body learns to self-regulate by reducing dependence. Independence becomes a survival strategy, not a preference. As the child grows, this pattern evolves. They often become perceptive, attuned, skilled at reading emotional shifts. They learn to anticipate others' needs, moods, and expectations. This attunement is not celebrated as intelligence, it is necessity. It keeps connections stable. But attunement without reciprocity leads to imbalance. The child learns to give without expecting, to listen without being heard, to adapt without being accommodated. And because this pattern feels familiar, it becomes replicated in adult relationships. The adult who cuts everyone off is often someone who once stayed too long. They were the listener, the emotional anchor, the reliable presence. They learned to tolerate inconsistency because it felt familiar. They learned to overextend because it kept relationships intact. And slowly, without realizing it, they internalized the belief that closeness requires endurance, not pleasure, not ease, endurance. This is why withdrawal later in life can feel so sudden to others. They never saw the exhaustion accumulate. They only saw the reliability, the strength, the availability. What they did not see was the quiet cost. In these early environments, boundaries were rarely modeled. The child was not taught how to say no without guilt, how to ask without shame, how to step back without fear of abandonment. So, as an adult, when emotional strain appears, the psyche reaches for the only regulation it knows: distance. Cutting people off becomes the adult version of childhood self-protection. It's the nervous system returning to a familiar solution: reduce exposure, minimize vulnerability, regain control. This does not mean the person lacks desire for connection. Often they crave it deeply. But craving without safety creates conflict, and unresolved conflict turns into withdrawal. There is also often an unspoken loyalty to early pain, a sense that expecting too much is dangerous, that hope leads to disappointment, that needing others invites loss. So instead of negotiating closeness, the psyche chooses certainty. Solitude is predictable. Distance is manageable. Silence does not demand adaptation. This is why cutting people off can feel relieving at first. It offers control where there was none before. But it is important to understand that this pattern is not born from detachment, it is born from adaptation, a response to environments where emotional needs were not met consistently enough to feel secure. The person did not learn that relationships could be mutual. They learned that relationships required management, and management is exhausting. As adulthood unfolds, the old strategy begins to crack. The body cannot sustain endless emotional labor. The nervous system begins to protest, and the first response is withdrawal, not because the person doesn't care, but because they have cared without protection for too long. This is where the pattern becomes visible, not as coldness, but as self-preservation learned early, practiced quietly, and activated when emotional capacity runs out. The mind does not withdraw without reason. It withdraws when it senses threat, not always a visible threat, often an internal one, the threat of depletion, overwhelm, or emotional collapse. When someone cuts everyone off, it is rarely because they believe others are dangerous. It is because their nervous system has learned that closeness costs more than it gives. From a psychological perspective, withdrawal is a form of regulation. Attachment theory helps explain this response. Individuals with avoidant or disorganized attachment styles often experience intimacy as simultaneously desired and distressing. Connection activates longing, but also alarm. The body prepares not for comfort, but for strain. This is not a conscious thought, it is a physiological memory. When emotional closeness begins, the nervous system scans for familiar patterns. Will this require caretaking? Will this demand endurance? Will this involve unpredictability? If the answer feels uncertain, the body tightens. Distance becomes the fastest path back to equilibrium. Over time, this response becomes automatic. Emotional burnout plays a central role here. Burnout is not limited to work or productivity, it occurs in relationships as well. When someone has spent years absorbing others' emotions, managing conflict, or maintaining harmony, their emotional reserves become depleted. At that point, even neutral interactions can feel draining, not because they are harmful, but because the system is already overloaded. Psychologically, the brain begins to associate people with effort, connection with obligation, presence with performance, so it reduces exposure. Avoidance is often misunderstood as indifference. In reality, it is an overactive protective response. The psyche is not avoiding intimacy, it is avoiding overwhelm. This is why cutting people off often happens without explanation. Explaining requires engagement. Engagement requires energy, and energy is precisely what is missing. The person may intend to reconnect later, to just take a break, but breaks extend, silence stretches, and eventually, absence becomes the new baseline. There is also a cognitive component to this pattern. Individuals who withdraw often hold an internal belief that their needs are inconvenient. This belief does not appear suddenly, it is learned, and it shapes behavior quietly. They do not ask for space, they take it. They do not negotiate boundaries, they disappear. Not because they want to hurt others, but because asking feels riskier than leaving. Asking requires vulnerability, leaving feels safer. Neurologically, this response is reinforced by relief. When the person withdraws, their nervous system calms. The absence of demands lowers stress. The mind experiences quiet. This relief becomes proof. Distance works, and so the behavior strengthens. The brain is designed to repeat what regulates it, even if the regulation is incomplete, even if it creates long-term loneliness. Short-term safety wins.
This is why people who cut everyone off often struggle to explain their behavior even to themselves. It does not feel like a decision, it feels like a necessity. There is often shame here, a sense of being too sensitive, too overwhelmed, or not built for relationships. These narratives are not accurate, but they feel convincing when emotional capacity is low. The truth is quieter. The person's system has not learned how to be close without losing itself. Until that learning occurs, distance remains the only known protection. This chapter is not about labeling withdrawal as healthy or unhealthy. It is about understanding it as communication. The psyche is signaling that something is unsustainable, that closeness as it currently exists is too costly. Cutting people off is not the absence of attachment, it is attachment in distress. A system that wants connection but cannot afford it under current conditions, so it chooses silence not as punishment but as preservation. And preservation, when nothing else feels safe, becomes the highest priority.
When someone cuts people off, the silence they enter is not empty, it is crowded with contradiction. Relief and loneliness exist side by side. The nervous system relaxes, but the heart does not fully follow. There is quiet, but it is not always calm. This is the internal push and pull. On one side, there is a deep craving for connection, a desire to be seen without effort, to speak without managing reactions, to be met without having to anticipate needs. This desire does not disappear just because the person has withdrawn. On the other side, there is fear, not of people themselves, but of what closeness has required in the past. The fear of being drained, of being misunderstood, of becoming emotionally responsible again. These two forces coexist. Psychologically, this creates cognitive and emotional dissonance. The person tells themselves they are better alone, yet feels the ache of absence. They value independence, yet feel a quiet grief when bonds loosen. They crave simplicity, yet miss being known. This tension is exhausting. The guilt often arrives unexpectedly. Thoughts surface late at night, questions without answers. Did they abandon people who cared? Did they misinterpret situations? Are they being unfair? Guilt is not proof that withdrawal was wrong. It is proof that attachment still exists. Those who cut everyone off are often deeply relational. Their withdrawal is not rooted in lack of care. It is rooted in caring without capacity. But the mind struggles with this nuance. It seeks clarity. Either connection is good or distance is good. Either the person is kind or selfish. The gray space between is uncomfortable. So the person oscillates. They consider reaching out, then pull back. They open a message, then close it. They imagine reconnecting, then feel their body tense. The desire is there, but so is the memory of exhaustion. This is where loneliness becomes complex. It is not simply missing others, it is missing connection that feels safe. And because safety has not yet been redefined, the loneliness remains unresolved. There is also a fear of being asked to explain. Explanation requires vulnerability. It requires putting words to experiences that were never validated. And many who withdraw have never been believed when they expressed emotional limits before. So they stay silent. Silence becomes a boundary when language feels dangerous. This inner conflict often leads to self-judgment. The person may label themselves as broken, avoidant, or incapable of intimacy. These labels offer certainty, but they obscure truth. The truth is more human. The person is navigating an internal system that has not yet learned how to balance closeness and self-preservation. They are not avoiding connection, they are avoiding the version of connection that depleted them. But the psyche does not differentiate easily. It responds to patterns, not possibilities. And so the push and pull continues. There are moments of longing, passing conversations overheard, memories of shared laughter, a wish to be part of something again. And there are moments of certainty, a sense that solitude is the only place where the self can breathe. Both are real. This chapter is important because it reveals that cutting people off does not resolve emotional complexity, it concentrates it.
The external noise fades, but the internal dialogue grows louder. Healing does not begin by forcing reconnection. It begins by understanding this conflict without judgment, by recognizing that wanting closeness and needing distance are not opposing truths. They are signals. Signals that the old way of relating no longer works and the new way has not yet been formed. Until that formation occurs, the psyche remains suspended between hunger and fear, reaching and retreating, searching for a version of connection that does not require disappearance to survive.
Every pattern carries a moment when it becomes visible. Not dramatic, not announced, but unmistakable. For people who cut everyone off, this moment often arrives in stillness, in the absence of distraction, when the silence they created no longer feels like escape, but like information. Something becomes clear. The realization is not people are the problem. It is the way connection has been happening is unsustainable. This distinction matters. Until this moment, withdrawal feels instinctive, something that happened rather than something understood. But awareness changes the experience. The person begins to notice patterns instead of just reactions. They see how often they overextended, how rarely they felt met, how frequently they ignored early signs of fatigue. This is not self-blame, it is self-recognition. Psychologically, this marks a shift from defensive behavior to reflective processing. The nervous system, having found temporary safety in distance, finally has enough quiet to evaluate the cost of the past. Memories reorganize, not as isolated disappointments, but as a consistent theme. Being the one who adapts, the one who listens longer than feels comfortable, the one who holds space while their own remains unattended. The realization is sobering. It reveals that withdrawal was not about disliking people, it was about losing oneself repeatedly in the act of staying connected. This awareness can bring grief. Grief for the years spent believing that endurance equaled love. Grief for the self that learned to tolerate imbalance because it felt familiar. Grief for relationships that might have survived if boundaries had existed sooner. But grief here is not regression, it is integration. There is also relief, a quiet release from self-judgment. The person no longer sees themselves as distant or broken. They see a system that adapted intelligently to overwhelming conditions. This is the turning point. The question subtly changes, not "why can't I connect?" but "what kind of connection have I been tolerating?" This shift reframes everything. It allows the person to recognize that cutting people off was not a failure of love, it was a response to chronic self-neglect within relationships. The psyche chose distance because closeness had become synonymous with disappearance. Awareness also brings responsibility, but not the kind that demands immediate action. It brings the responsibility to observe patterns without rushing to fix them. This is crucial. Many people try to resolve this realization by swinging to the opposite extreme, either isolating permanently or forcing reconnection prematurely. Neither is integration. Both are avoidance. The realization asks for something quieter, discernment, to notice who drains and who nourishes, to distinguish between discomfort and harm, to separate intimacy from obligation. At this stage, the person may still remain distant, but the distance now has meaning. It is no longer an automatic reflex, it becomes a holding space, a pause where the self is allowed to exist without performing. Psychologically, this marks the beginning of boundary formation, not yet expressed outwardly, but felt internally. The person begins to sense where their limits are, not intellectually, but somatically. They notice when their body tightens, when fatigue appears early, when resentment begins to form. These signals were always present, they are simply being heard now. This realization does not erase loneliness, but it reframes it. Loneliness becomes the cost of transition, not the proof of defect. The person stands between two worlds, the old relational pattern that no longer works and a new one that has not yet been built. And in that space, something important happens.
They stop running from themselves. They stop interpreting withdrawal as weakness. They see it as communication, a message from a system that finally refused to abandon itself again. This is not the end of the story, but it is the moment where disappearance becomes understanding, and understanding makes a different future possible.
Healing does not begin with return. It begins with recognition. For someone who has cut everyone off, healing is not about opening the doors again. It is about understanding why they had to close them in the first place. The psyche cannot integrate what it has not first honored. At this stage, solitude changes its meaning. It is no longer an escape, it becomes a laboratory, a place where emotional signals can be felt without interruption, where the nervous system can recalibrate, where the self can exist without monitoring others. This is where integration quietly begins. Psychologically, integration means bringing together parts of the self that were previously split, the part that longs for connection and the part that learned to withdraw to survive. Neither is wrong, neither needs to disappear. They need to be in dialogue. This internal dialogue creates discernment, the ability to sense when closeness feels grounding and when it feels depleting, when discomfort signals growth and when it signals boundary violation. This discernment was not learned earlier because the environment did not allow it. Now, in stillness, it can form. One of the most important shifts during healing is the redefinition of safety. For a long time, safety meant distance, silence, control. But true safety is not the absence of people, it is the absence of self-erasure. This realization changes the relationship to solitude. Alone time becomes restorative rather than avoidant. Connection becomes optional rather than compulsory. And optional connection feels different. It allows choice. The person begins to notice that not all closeness is the same. Some interactions feel light, others heavy. Some require performance, others allow rest. This awareness is not judgment, it is clarity. Integration does not demand cutting people back in indiscriminately. It allows for selectivity without guilt. It permits proximity without obligation. It replaces endurance with consent. Emotionally, this can feel unfamiliar. There may be moments of anxiety when choosing differently, moments where the old fear resurfaces. If I say no, will I be abandoned? If I stay quiet, will I be forgotten? These fears are echoes, not predictions. Healing does not silence them immediately, it acknowledges them without obeying them. Over time, the nervous system learns something new, that closeness can be paced, that presence does not require sacrifice, that boundaries do not destroy connection, they shape it. This learning happens slowly, not through affirmations, not through forcing exposure, but through lived experience. Small interactions with the self remains intact, brief connections that end before depletion, honest pauses that do not result in rejection. These moments accumulate. They teach the body that safety can exist within relationship, not just outside of it. Importantly, healing also involves releasing the fantasy of being understood by everyone. The person learns that their boundaries may confuse others, that their withdrawal may never be fully explained, and that this is not failure. Integration means allowing misunderstanding without self-betrayal. This is often where peace emerges, not the peace of isolation, but the peace of alignment. The person no longer cuts people off impulsively. They also no longer stay out of fear. They move closer or farther with awareness, with permission. They become less reactive, less extreme, more present with their own signals. Healing here is quiet. It does not announce itself through reconnection or social expansion. It reveals itself in how the person feels during contact, in whether they leave conversations feeling more like themselves, not less. Integration means the self is no longer something to protect at all costs. It becomes something that can exist in the presence of others. And that changes everything. It is seen as absence, as avoidance, as a closing of the heart. But distance is also a message.
For those who have cut everyone off, it was never about erasing others. It was about preserving something fragile that had been stretched too thin. It was about creating space where the self could finally breathe without explanation. Distance in this sense is not the opposite of love. It is the pause love takes when it has been asked to endure without rest. There is a quiet intelligence in withdrawal, a wisdom that recognizes limits before collapse, a voice that says, "This is too much," when no other language feels safe enough to speak. The world often demands constant availability, immediate responses, emotional openness without consideration for capacity. In such a world, retreat becomes radical, not because it rejects connection, but because it refuses to perform it. Those who step away are not weak. They are responding to a truth their bodies recognized long before their minds could articulate it. That truth is simple. Connection without protection erodes the self. Distance creates the conditions for remembering who one is when no one is asking anything. It reveals desires that were buried under responsibility. It restores sensitivity that had been dulled by endurance. And once the self is remembered, connection can be reconsidered. Not all distance lasts forever. Some distances are transitional. Others are permanent. Neither is wrong. What matters is the honesty behind them. Distance becomes harmful only when it is used to punish or to disappear from oneself. But when it is used to listen, to integrate, to recover, it becomes sacred. The people who cut everyone off often return differently, quieter, more selective, less willing to trade their wholeness for belonging. They do not reconnect to prove anything. They reconnect when it feels safe. And sometimes they do not reconnect at all. They build a life where connection exists in small, meaningful doses, where silence is not empty, where solitude is not loneliness. This is not a lesser life. It is a deliberate one. The psyche speaks in many languages: anxiety, fatigue, withdrawal. Each is a message, not a flaw. When withdrawal appears, it asks to be understood, not judged. It asks, what has become too much? Where has the self been lost? What needs to change for closeness to feel safe again? Distance is not the end of connection. It is the beginning of truth. And in that truth, there's the possibility of relationships that do not demand disappearance, of closeness that does not cost identity, of presence that feels rest. The psychology of those who cut everyone off is not a story of abandonment. It is a story of return, a return to the self.